Great. President Stivers, Speaker Osborne, thanks so much for being here with us today. We know you've got a busy schedule and appreciate your time and your service. I'm just going to get right to it. Are we going to have a special session on pensions this year?
David knows the answer.
But
I told him I was going to pass everything to him
I will let Robert answer it.
We've been meeting. You know, I'm a realist and a pragmatist. Window is getting closer to being shut. We're about 3.5 weeks from a regular session. There's no doubt that I would have preferred, and I think David would have preferred, to have dealt with this issue in a special session because it is going to so impact the rest of the session, in particular our budget. But time is limited. That's the best way I can answer it because neither he nor I have that authority or ability under the Constitution to call a session. So that's the best way I can explain it.
Okay, great. For both of you, but starting with Speaker Osborne, how close are you to a compromise? And if you can share this, what are some of the sticking points that might be remaining?
Well, I think today we are probably closer than we've ever been before on getting a compromise and getting something that all of our members can support, or the vast majority of our members can support, as well as the Senate. At this point, I'm probably not ready to talk about particulars, but we have taken advisement of the different interest groups that have been involved and addressed many of the concerns that were brought to light when the original proposal came out, and I think we're getting closer.
What work yet remains before maybe a deal is ready to go?
Again, I think that would I would have to comment on specifics at that point, but there are still a few issues to work out.
Senator Stivers, what does success look like for pension reform? If you can't talk about the particulars, just kind of general guiding principles, what would a successful pension reform bill look like to you?
Well, I think people first need to understand the problems with the pensions. And I use the KTRS because it's by far larger than any other system. And if you look at volume, us being here at University of Kentucky, you know, the KTRS system is about the size of a basketball. And if you look at the other systems, KERS, now CERS is different altogether, but what will impact our budgets, it will be different for the city of Lexington and others. But KERS is about the size of a baseball. So when you think about the volume, to me, the KTRS is by far more significant. And if you look at that under the defined benefit plan that we currently have and the style it's run, there's been some question about whether do we fund it appropriately or not. Well, for argument purpose, we can say we should have funded it more. Even if we had met expectations, which statutorily were not required, we'd still be $12 billion in the hole. So if you think of all the money that the TRS system wanted was there, we'd still be $12 billion in the hole. So you have to look at that and understand that we have to change the system. And to that extent, we have to change it because if we don't, the system will continue to be underfunded. And we can't change that underfunding mechanism unless we just throw much, much more money at it. So one, success is change the system. Two, we're currently appropriating about $1.2 billion of an $11.4 billion budget to fund our pension system. Well, that's around 10%, roughly. So you look at that and you think, well, what do we have to do if we don't change it? We have to reduce our exposure. And I think many of the headlines that have been played out in the papers, and if anybody's from the news media here, I want to actually say they've done a pretty good job of covering, you know, what types of monies are going to be needed. It's going to go as high as another $1.2 billion. So we go from 1.2 to 2.4, somewhere around in that area, and that is for KERS and KTRS. Now, that's going to be a little bit different for the CERS groups because they're going to have similar exposure because the systems continue to spiral downward. So the second component for success is reducing that exposure. We're never going to get below that $1.2 billion that we're currently at for many, many years. But hopefully we won't have to go as high as $2.4 billion. And so anything we can reduce that liability, then that is the second part that I would say would be success.
Speaker Osborne, any other additional points you wanted to mention?
Well, I do think that Robert's right. We've got to get to something that ultimately gives us a point where we're out of this. And that's the good thing about the proposal to go to level dollar funding. Even though that makes the budgetary issues much, much more difficult, it does give us an end point. And we've got, as Robert has said a number of times, we've got to stop digging the hole and then start putting some dirt back in it.
And everybody probably knows this, but KTRS is the Teachers Retirement System, KERS is the State Government Retirement System, and CERS is local government. Speaker Osborne, could you explain a little bit what level dollar funding means?
Essentially, level dollar funding takes our entire unfunded liability and amortizes it over a period of time.
So like a mortgage?
It basically becomes a mortgage, yes. And so there is a definite endpoint to getting rid of that unfunded liability, which heretofore all we've been doing is making a portion of interest payments, and now we're going to start actually paying off principal and retiring debt.
Right. A lot of the chambers and businesses across the state have been saying that inaction is not an option. I mean, you talked about what the impact would be. It's not just the impact of the pension reform, but the impact of doing nothing. And I think I read something that there are now more retirees in KERS than there are active workers to support them. So if pension reform is not passed, what impact do you see that having on the state?
Oh, it's dramatic. When you start talking about the magnitude of a $30 or $60 billion unfunded liability that we've got to pay off with an annual budget, it's $11 billion. It's dramatic and it's crippling. It actually cripples our ability to deliver so many other services. I mean, you can take thousands of police officers on the streets, thousands of teachers in the classrooms, additional funds for opioid addiction and treatment, and it cripples our ability to deliver our services. We are dealing with a budget problem that is much greater than our budget is. So we've got to address it. And on top of that, if we don't address it from a budgetary standpoint, then we're also going to be faced with at some point in time with being unable to deliver money to our retirees. I mean, we're going to run out of money. KERS is projected to run out of money within 5 years, and we simply can't get to that point.
You've got a couple hundred business people in the room today. What can we do to support you as you make those tough decisions? We know that there are a lot of voices out there who are advocating for their particular point of view, and obviously there are people who are personally impacted about it. But we're all impacted to some degree in this room for the reasons that you outlined, Speaker. Is there anything that we can be doing to help support you in a special session or regular session, depending on when it's addressed?
Well, I would suggest just exactly forums like this. People need to learn about this problem, and Carla, it does. There's not going to be a single person that won't be impacted by this, because if you're going to continue to take billions of dollars, and it is now becoming a multi-billion-dollar problem out of our budget, that means everybody's going to be impacted. So whether it be the universities, be it public education, be it delivery of services, from whatever it may be, even to the simple fact of building a road, it's going to be a problem. Or if you don't do it from reducing, which would be budget cuts, then everybody's going to have to start talking about what they're going to take out of their pocket, and tax increases, and pretty substantial tax increases to deal with the issue. And so voicing your opinions, having input, talking about the problem, educating individuals, that becomes the biggest thing, because when you sit down and go through the numbers and you start talking about 7 pension systems overall, and there are subcategories within each pension system, it's not something that either one of us really want to be doing, but it's reality. We have to. And when the actuaries come back, it's not me, it's not David, it's not the governor, it's not any of our colleagues in any party in either chamber, but when the individuals from outside our state, Moody's, Fitch, all these other groups come back and say, you all have got a problem, a real problem. We're going to start reducing your bond ratings. Cost of business is going to go up, and until you deal with it, you're going to be on the list. And everybody knows it's hard to get off those lists these days once you get on them, but that's the problems we have. And unless we deal with it, it's just going to continue to get worse.
And there's already been a downgrade, is that correct?
We're considered one of the worst business climate states from that perspective. There is. I think, thank God for Illinois or something like that.
You know, I will tell you that the business community has been great in this situation, though, because the vast majority of people for years have viewed this pension crisis. I can remember in 2007 when then President Williams started first speaking on this issue. It kind of resonated a little bit like our national debt situation. Well, it doesn't really impact me. It just, you know, it's something that we don't have to deal with now. And I think it's been the business community's understanding of the fact that this impacts our ability to be competitive as a business state, and it impacts our ability to do meaningful tax reform. Anytime we're dealing with these type of budget constraints, and the business community has been a significant driver in this effort.
Let's transition to a much easier topic, budget. And you talked about the impact that will be coming up with the next biennial budget, but there also are some challenges even in this current budget that we're in. The governor has asked for some proposed cuts from most agencies, I guess, other than maybe education, higher education, and a few others. Where do those mid-year cuts stand? Do you think those will go through, or is that something that the consensus forecasting group, that the revenues might be better than expected, or where do you see that?
I think the consensus forecasting group is scheduled to meet in the next 2 weeks, I think.
Before we get into session.
Before we get into session to release their new estimates. So certainly, I think it's probably a little bit folly to think that those numbers are going to be fabulous. But hopefully they will be better than maybe some have anticipated. There has been no budget reduction order that's been issued by the governor, but he has asked the cabinets, the individual cabinets, to come up with proposals on how to make those reductions in their budget. So I fully anticipate that there will be some degree of budget cuts in the second half of the year.
I agree with David. Hopefully, you know, I tell people around the 9th or 10th of the month is maybe the most interesting day in Frankfort and the state, if people really understand what they're looking at. It's when the budget director's office comes back with the last month receipts, and they tell you where we're going from the projections, and are we on track with what we were given when we predicated our budget on, and now at this point in time, about a year ago. And, you know, we'll make decisions. Reality is we're not hitting projections. The reality is, generally, we're a lag state. I think the nation's performing at about a 3 or 3.2% growth rate, and we're down around 1. So hopefully, being a lag state, we'll continue to follow that tradition. We're generally 6 to 9 months coming out of recessions, but we're generally 6 to 9 months behind going into recessions. We're just that's our performance, and hopefully the second half will see an uptick. But if it doesn't, by Constitution, we're a balanced budget state, and the governor will have to make the cuts to balance it by the end of the year.
Do you see any other reasons other than us being a lag state, anything that concerns you going forward in terms of the revenues not meeting projections?
I don't think there's anything that I have seen that specifically indicates why we've gotten there, or anything that causes exceptional concern. It's just we know that the economy is growing. We know that there's additional resources at work. We just haven't seen those hit the bottom line yet.
Regardless of pension reform, when it happens, what it looks like, how big cuts do you think will be coming in the upcoming budget? Because you're going to have some extra money that's going to need to go to pensions regardless. How do you see this budget shaking out? How tough is it going to be?
Draconian. Okay. If we don't, I mean, look, we're talking about 10% more of our budget going into the pension system, not to mention just natural growth costs. Hopefully we're not leaving the water on and having any frozen pipes, because those would be additional expenses. But there are always expenses. One of the things we've talked about, and truly, and this is how it affects us. If we were having the forest fires in California here, that's an unexpected expense, and we generally will see good years where we'll have maybe $10 or $15 million. Then something like that, I think it was a few years ago, we had the ice storm that ran the Ohio River. That cost us about $25 million to deal with that. So there's all these unbudgeted expenses, things of that nature, that you know you're going to have, but you just don't know what they are, that always pop up, and you deal with them. And just natural growth and cost of living raises, cost of electricity, anything else, just operations go up every year. So if you just think about that on a CPI and what our needs are with a pension, there's only a couple options, and none of them are fun.
So you've got at least 10% of the budget going to pensions, and then if you take education, higher education, how big of a percent is that? I'm trying to give people an idea of, okay, cut the budget, that's great, but when you take out some of those key services, you're left with a really small piece of the pie if you exempt those key services.
I think a lot of it depends on what we do hold harmless. You know, in the past, we've held education harmless, we've held corrections harmless. If we do not hold those things harmless, I think we could be looking at potential cuts as large as 10%. I think if we do hold some of those things harmless, then certainly much more dramatic than that.
And about 55% of our budget is in education. Choose where you want to place it, but higher ed, K through 12. So if you exempt those, there's 55% gone. Corrections, it's very difficult for the governor's office to deal with corrections. Because of two factors. One, opioid problem. Two, they don't control intake. Intake is on the judicial branch side, so if you can't control that intake, it's hard and difficult to deal with the prison population. So with the two combined, there was a pretty substantial shortfall in their budget this year because the population is increasing due to the intake and what's going on with the opioids problems. And those types of things come into play. And so when you start thinking about that you really can't affect the corrections budget, which is about 5% of our total budget, and then you have another 55% in education, that's 60% of your budget that if you try to exempt education and you can't really control corrections, you're locked in. You got 40% that you have to get that from, and that just becomes, that 10% of 40% then becomes 2.5 times bigger within what's left.
Tax reform. When do you all see that happening? General session, special session?
Well, I'm going to say this. You know, if you're on the coast in Florida, which might be really good right now, considering how cold it is, you can generally see 12 miles out onto the ocean before the curvature of the world takes it out of view, the ship or the light. I haven't seen it come over that curve yet. I'll just put it that way.
What has to happen? What do you think has to happen before tax reform can occur in terms of research or in terms of educating members or the public or getting comment? What needs to happen for that ship to come over the horizon?
I think it's all those things.
I agree. I was just getting ready to say every one of those.
It is. There's a reason that we haven't done it. It's because it's an incredibly difficult thing to get your arms around. One of the things that I think is one of the most basic parts of tax reform is deciding what your goal of tax reform is. You know, we've had multiple tax reform commissions over the years that have tried to study the issue, and I've always kind of faulted some of those studies because I think that most of those attempts have started with the objective of how do we raise money, how do we raise revenues, and I think that's an inappropriate assumption or an inappropriate way to start. I think that the most appropriate way to deal with tax reform is to first of all establish what makes Kentucky the most competitive place to do business and what makes it the best place to raise a family. And once we determine what that tax system looks like, then we start addressing the numbers side of it. And I think that certainly revenue increases can be a part of tax reform, but I think it's not necessarily appropriate to allow those to drive tax reform.
I agree with David. I think, first of all, we have to define what government really needs to be. I had an interesting little event happen to me. I spoke at a group my colleagues from around the United States back in the summer. And one of the things I got to do was read about Madison and what his belief of government was. And, what do we do? That which the individual can't provide for himself, collectively we do. So I think we need to, reinvent maybe or define what we really believe government should be, and has it gotten into areas that we probably don't need to be in. What we want to do is, as David said, and it is extremely complex, and I've used this example on the ad valorem tax on bourbon. That was a local property tax. Well, you couldn't really repeal it because all of a sudden you had local school systems who were dependent on that revenue. You couldn't take it away from them. So we devised another mechanism. But when we devised that mechanism, then that allowed or gave some impetus. I don't want to say it gave all the impetus to the bourbon industry really expanding and booming. So when you tie good tax policy in, and we actually lost about $12 million in taxes at the state level, it generated by far more than that because the base expanded significantly. And I use my old friend Walter Blevins, who, even though not much legal bourbon, I'll put it that way, is distilled in Morehead, Kentucky, or Rowan County. Hopefully nobody goes back to Rowan County and tells them I said that, but he saw the benefits of it because they saw a $15 or $18 billion stay mill put up there with about 45 to 50 employees that had to make the white oak barrels to be shipped over to where all the bourbon is. And that's what we hope you see from tax policy, that the base will expand, that no individual will be subjected to any more tax revenues. Instead of having 200 business people here paying taxes, we'll have 400 business people here next year. But, realities are we'll deal with it. It's extremely complex because where we collect a lot of taxes, inventory tax, we get a part of that, but about 110 million of the 135 million goes back to the local districts because it's really, truly a property tax, a local property tax. So you have to go through all those complexities of where the tax come from, how you collect it, how you disperse it, and who's impacted by it. And it's by far more complex than pensions are.
Robert brings up an interesting point about local government taxation or local taxation. Comprehensive tax reform really needs to take into account how we allow local governments to tax themselves and kind of redefine what role state government is going to play in local funding. Right now we are definitely a top-heavy taxing state. We collect vast majority of taxes are filtered down through local governments. Obviously, the further we get away from local government, the less efficient we are in spending those monies. And I voted for the local option sales tax a couple of years ago, but I thought it was a bill that stopped short of doing what it really needed to do, especially if we're going to go to the Constitution. If we're going to go to the Constitution, let's allow local governments to actually figure out how they best need to raise their revenues. Let's take some of that responsibility away from state government, give it back to local governments. Local option may have worked fine for certain communities, worked fine for Lexington and Louisville, some of the more suburban and metropolitan areas. But in many areas, it wasn't going to be beneficial. And every county and city and municipality in the state has something to offer. And for us to limit their ability to raise revenues based on a sales tax probably isn't appropriate.
So it sounds like broadening the base and lowering the rate maybe would be a guiding principle. Tackling local tax reform might be a guiding principle. Anything else? I mean, a shift to more of a consumption tax, or any other things that you think tax reform just on a broad level should be considered or included?
I think everything has to be looked at. And it's much like pension reforms. You really can't talk about a singular issue because as you talk about one component of a pension reform, it will have some impact on another component. So as we've talked about scoring, you can't score in silos. And it's the same thing with tax reform because you have so many things that, we collect, and I'll go back to that local taxing district, but guess what it affects? A property tax, which we get a component of it. It affects your school board, it affects your county government, may affect your city government, your library, hospital, ambulance service, all these types of different taxing districts. And it just becomes extremely hard to deal with that without getting in really deep into the weeds and how you impact one tax will impact how you expend monies, and one tax may affect 10 different entities. So it's not only how you bring your revenues in, but then how you're going to disperse them. And so it becomes something that you really can't compartmentalize or say in component, well, we're going to do this one, because this one can't be siloed because it's going to have tentacles in so many other places.
Bob mentioned last year you all came out of the gate strong and hard with repealing prevailing wage and right to work. I know there are big issues on the table this session, it's a budget session, the other things we talked about. Are there any other priorities that are on your plate, or is this just really doing the nuts and bolts things that have to get done?
I think there are a few things that are going to be priority items for us. Leader Shell has an essential skills bill that he has been working on for the last year, or actually over a year. That is going to be one of our priority bills. I think some potential tort reform issues may be in there. Adam Koenig is working on his workers' comp bill again. So I think those will be priorities. I know Chairman Santoro has put together his infrastructure work group and making some recommendations on infrastructure funding and how to raise revenues in that. So there's quite a bit of other work to be done behind all the other noise.
Do you see the infrastructure bill as being part of tax reform or potentially handled separately?
I think it could be handled separately. Maybe global infrastructure tax reform would have to wait until overall tax reform, but I think it's possible to do some degree of it independent of total reform.
And let me just follow up also on the workers' comp legislation. I know a lot of people in the audience would be interested in that. It ran into a little bit of difficulty last session, I think primarily with some of the public safety folks who had some concerns. Do you feel like a compromise is going to get that through this time, or what do you think the sticking points may be?
I think there's been a lot of progress made on that. I think part of it had to do with the black lung issue that President Stivers was so involved with, and getting that passed and getting that out of the way. I think we're in a much better position now.
President Stivers, any other priorities that you want to add?
Well, we definitely want to change the business climate, and something that because that's what it's about, is creating jobs. And I generally don't do this, but since I have the man from Haddix over here looking at me, Luther Deaton, we've talked about this. We're going to have to figure out how we're going to diversify our economy in certain areas, and we have created and many reasons, and I'm not pointing fingers, but we've created areas of haves and have-nots. And I'm very candid about my area. Unless we create private investment in enterprise, and that's one of the things I want to look at, how we get private dollars into the areas that are donee regions, then we're just not going to go as far as we can in this state. It's great that Louisville, Lexington, Northern Kentucky have seemed to have prospered. They have missions well beyond their geographic confines or their borders, but we're going to have to create a different dynamic in the rural areas, because you're just not seeing employment. You're seeing the out-migration. You're seeing heavier, more emphasis on the opioid problem. And so we're going to have to look at some type of situations that we create stimulus there. We can't continue to be dependent on government. It's going to have to be private sector type of investment to create jobs. It's all about creating jobs in those areas. But everything that David talked about are things we want to look at, but remembering what you brought up, the ultimate policy document in Kentucky is the budget.
Okay.
And so that will be on the forefront.
Right. We've got time for a few questions from the audience. What's the appetite for expanded gaming to help close the budget gap and or legalizing marijuana?
I've just eaten, so I'm not very hungry for either.
You know, I've been supportive of expanded gambling for years and have sponsored the bill several times. But I think as a general, that there is very little appetite for it right now. I know that Jerry Miller from Louisville and Morgan McGarvey are working on a bill that would be a kind of a companion bill in the Senate and the House. But I think ultimately probably not a lot of appetite. The governor has been very plain in his insistence that he would veto anything regarding legalization of marijuana. So I think, again, there's probably not a lot of appetite.
I don't want to, Carla, I don't want to be so flippant on that issue. I differ with David on many issues we do, but I just differ on expanding gaming. As it stands in the current status, I'm fine with what it's doing right now. We have court rulings that may come down that may change the landscape, so be it. But as it stands, I'm fine with it. Expanding it, truly I believe gaming is a zero-sum game. It's not a synergistic. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose, and at the bottom line, no increase in revenues, no increase in wealth, except for one party as the other one loses. And that's my basic premise behind that. As to legalization of marijuana, I think there's an underlying issue with that. Some people have said, well, why don't you do it for medicinal purposes? Medical marijuana, okay. I have had more meetings than I can count on every finger and every toe I have about, well, we want medical marijuana. Fine, produce me a study. Show me something from, John Hopkins. Let's go to any group. Let's go to Mayo. Let's go to the American Medical Association. Give me something on my hand that shows me that there is a tier level study that says it is medicinal or therapeutic. I'm gonna hold up my hand and show you every one they've delivered to me. Right there, zero. People say, well, it makes me feel better. It may, but we can go and have 3 shots of bourbon and we'll feel better too. Hopefully.
That number may be increasing.
At least
right?
for now, may feel tomorrow, but truly, if we did the cannabidiol oils a few years ago and we changed it because they did bring the studies, and if you can show that it has some type of therapeutic value, I'm all for it. But go talk to our colleagues in Colorado and they talk about, boy, if we just didn't really mess this up the way we've done it. And now you're starting to see individuals who have workplace environments that their employers are coming in and saying, oops, I can smoke because it's legal. Well, oops, my workers' comp's going up, my general liability's going up because while you're here, you're not really at full and best strength because you have some type of impairment. And so I can't see recreational, I cannot see it. It's a gateway drug, anybody who's involved in it. And what's really amazing to me is we have this huge push to ban smoking. And then we want to go legalize the use of marijuana, which has like 50 times more carcinogen value than smoking does. It's diametrically opposed. And so, I just can't grasp or comprehend that. So when I say I don't have much of an appetite for either, I really don't.
The medical marijuana thing is, the whole issue is somewhat perplexing. I think that while there may not be a lot of empirical evidence, I think there's at least some anecdotal evidence that people do derive some benefits from it. And certainly we don't seem to have any problem prescribing narcotics in this country. They're running rampant. So I don't think that it can be an assumption that we have this moral objection to a narcotic being utilized to get relief or to get some medical benefit from. The problem with the medical marijuana is that there are no empirical studies that give dosing standards, that give toxicity standards, that give certain safety controls. So it's difficult. I don't think anybody wants to make a criminal out of somebody that's trying to help themselves. But it's difficult to try to figure out how to quantify that.
And since we're on this, and he brings up a really good topic, if this group wants to do something that could probably help this state across party lines and everything else, and some people may not be real thrilled with this, but especially people in the medical profession, we need to change prescribing habits. Totally. I had a back surgery a little over a year ago, done here at the University of Kentucky, 2 rods, 4 screws, and a few discs fused. Within a week, I wasn't taking anything. There's not a day in my life that pain, as I even sit here, you see me moving, that I don't hurt. But I don't take anything like that. We don't need to be an opioid dependent society, and we need to be changing attitudes and habits and prescribing habits for that, because that is part of the problem for our workforce. It's a driving cost in our correction system, and it needs to change. We have like 2% of the world's population, but we prescribe 90% of the opioids in the world in the United States. That's wrong. We've got to deal with pain some other way, and it is something that has to happen because then people start abusing it. But the place that it starts, and you can't blame pharmacists because all they do is fill a prescription. It's the individuals who write the prescriptions that have to change what they do as their practices.
We have time for one more question. Economic development and our transportation infrastructure are so linked. What is your feeling about increasing the gas tax? Is that something you'd support?
You know, I think that there can be pretty broad support for some type of an increase in the gas tax, but it doesn't, I don't think it addresses the underlying problem, and that is the fact that we have a system that is giving us inherently declining revenues. As I saw something just the other day that in the last 10 years, we've gone from 2,000 electric cars to almost 30,000 electric cars. And that's not really dramatic in the scope of the entire state. But when you look at what that will be over the next 10 years, it really is dramatic. And so we've got to find a funding source that allows us to account for increased fuel efficiency, for increased electrical use for cars. And what that system is going to exactly look like is difficult, because one of the great advantages that we have in Kentucky is half the world travels through it. We have more miles of interstate highway than any other state in the country. It's an amazing thing. But so that is a great competitive advantage for us, and a lot of out-of-state money comes in through our gasoline tax. So it's going to be a problem that gets much larger than just the driving habits of Kentuckians.
I totally agree with David. You know, gas tax is not a solution, because I think there was an article in one of the papers that talked about how now cities are building the electric car places to re-up your battery, and that electric car is not paying any gas tax. But it's still, when those four wheels hit the road, it's still having impact on it. And it's much like what we've seen in technology does amazing things to our budget. You go back 20 years ago, it was a big deal if you had a bag phone in your car. And we had no taxes on that. It was on landlines and transition and the switching fees. And so now, if I were to ask people how many people had landlines now today, very few people probably hold their hands up. If you asked that 20 years ago, everybody would have it. Now if you ask who had cell phones, even though mine's dead right now, 20 years ago people would think, no, they don't. Well, we have to change our taxing structure. That's a perfect example of where we didn't 20 years ago. This is a perfect example where we need to now. Because technology is changing the system of how we deliver travel. And I want to say this, if I can briefly. Bob mentioned something about Lexington last year and what this city did for the Southern Legislative Conference. Went to Biloxi, and truly back to tourism. So many people came to Lexington and they thought it was just a great exposure and a great event that the city of Lexington put on. They were extremely impressed with the assets we have in central Kentucky, but many people came from throughout the state. We do have a wonderful state. It's great for tourism, and we need to solve all these problems that we have out here to even make it a better and greater state. Because when you go out and you hear what people saw, what they experience, and they think, we want to come back to Lexington, Kentucky. And I appreciate all the help that people did in putting that together a year ago.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Senator Stivers and Jocelyn. We appreciate your time today, and more importantly, for all the work that you do that often is under a microscope and gets criticized, but we appreciate everything you're doing for the state.
Thanks,
also, thank you to our sponsors, without whom this event would not be possible, and stay tuned for 2018. But thank you, everyone, for being here.